Eleanor Brooks did not cry when they laughed at her. She stood in the center of the harvest ball, with her torn hem dragging the floor, her chin lifted, her hands steady at her sides, while 200 of Virginia's finest citizens pretended not to notice, or worse, smiled. She had promised herself she would not give them the satisfaction. But her lip trembled. Just once. And Benjamin Carter, standing across the room with his back to the wall and his jaw tight, saw it. He set down his glass, and he walked toward her. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the harvest ball. Eleanor Brooks burned her hand on the kettle and took it as a sign. She had been trying to press the lavender ribbon on her good dress. Her only good dress, the pale blue one her mother had sewn the summer before the fever took her. And her hand slipped, and the kettle caught her along the inside of her wrist, and she bit down on the sound that tried to come out of her mouth because her Aunt Vera was still sleeping, and the woman needed her rest. Eleanor wrapped her wrist in a strip of linen, tied it tight, and went back to pressing the ribbon. She wasn't going to let a burn stop her. She wasn't going to let anything stop her. She had been invited to Carter Manor for the first time in 3 years, and she understood exactly what that meant. Not as a social triumph, but as a necessity. Her father's charity school was one bad winter away from closing. 3 of the teaching supplies had been borrowed. The coal account was 3 months behind. Someone at that ball would know someone who could help. And Eleanor had learned since her father's death that help did not come to people who stayed home. She finished the ribbon. She pinned her hair. She told her aunt she would be back before midnight. Her aunt caught her hand at the door, the burned one, which made Eleanor flinch, and said, "Hold your head up in there. Your father built something real. Don't let them make you forget that." "I won't," Eleanor said. She meant it when she said it. Carter Manor sat on a rise above the river, and in the long Virginia summer evenings, when the light came in low and golden off the water, it looked like something a man had built, not to impress the world, but to stand against it. 3 stories of pale stone. Columns across the front. Lanterns already lit in every window, even before the sun had finished setting. Eleanor arrived in her aunt's borrowed carriage, which listed slightly to the left and made a sound on cobblestones that she could only describe as embarrassing. The driver, old Thomas, who had worked for her family since before she was born, helped her down with the same dignity he gave everyone, regardless of whether the carriage was fine or not. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "You look lovely, Miss Eleanor," he said, which was kind even if they both understood the context. She walked up the front steps without hesitating. That was the first rule she had made for herself after her father died. Never hesitate at a threshold. Once you let yourself pause, you start reasoning yourself backward. Inside Carter Manor was everything its exterior promised. Chandeliers, music already playing from somewhere deeper in the house, the smell of beeswax and flowers, and something roasted that made her stomach remind her she hadn't eaten since noon. Women in silk and men in fine coats, and the low, warm roar of 200 conversations happening at once. Eleanor knew almost no one. That was not entirely true. She recognized faces. She had grown up attending these events once when her father was still alive, and the Brooks name still carried weight in Albemarle County. But recognition and knowing were different things. The women who nodded at her tonight were nodding at a memory, and not always a fond one. She found the edge of the room and stayed there watching, listening, looking for the faces she needed to find the county commissioner's wife who had once expressed interest in the school's reading program. The minister's eldest daughter, who organized charitable donations. The man from Richmond, who had written a letter 2 springs ago saying he admired her father's work and would like to discuss continued funding. She had replies to memorize. She had her father's legacy to represent. She was not here to dance. The first conversation went reasonably well. The second was interrupted before it could begin. By the third, Eleanor had started to understand the shape of the evening, which was that Caroline Prescott had arrived 20 minutes before Eleanor had, and had spent those 20 minutes making certain that her version of Eleanor Brooks was the first one people received. Caroline Prescott was 26. She was the daughter of a state senator and the fiancée of a man who owned half the river property between Charlottesville and the county line, and she had a way of saying things that sounded almost kind, while meaning nothing of the sort. Eleanor had known her since they were girls. She had learned early that Caroline's pleasantries were a kind of weapon, sharpened and aimed before the words even left her mouth. "Eleanor," Caroline said, appearing at her elbow sometime around 8 o'clock. "How wonderful you came! I wasn't sure you'd be able to afford the wealthy evening. You know what I mean." "I do know what you mean," Eleanor said. "And I'm well, thank you for asking." Caroline smiled. "Of course. And the school still operating." "Still operating. Marvelous." The smile stayed, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "I was just telling Margaret Hollis that your father did such admirable work. Such a shame about the circumstances of the estate." "It is," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "And yet here we both are." Caroline's smile flickered. Then she was swept away by someone who needed her opinion on a ribbon color, and Eleanor exhaled slowly through her nose and went back to looking for the commissioner's wife. She found her near the punch table, and the conversation was promising. The woman remembered Eleanor's father warmly asked real questions about the school's enrollment, mentioned a donation her husband might be willing to revisit, and Eleanor was beginning to feel for the first time all evening that coming had been the right choice. That was when the elderly servant walked too close to the edge of the tablecloth. Eleanor saw it happen in pieces. The woman, gray-haired, moving carefully, carrying a tray of empty glasses, caught her heel on the trailing edge of the cloth. The tray tilted. Eleanor was closest. She moved without thinking, one hand to steady the tray, her body turning to block the worst of it, her foot catching on the lower ruffle of her own dress in the process. The tray didn't fall. The woman didn't fall. But Eleanor heard the tear before she felt it. A clean, bright sound. The kind of sound that a room full of people hears all at once. She looked down. The hem of her dress, the pale blue dress, her mother's ribbon, the one good dress she owned, had caught on the heel of her shoe and torn from the waist seam down nearly to the floor. Not a small tear. Not one that could be hidden or managed or walked off. A tear that left the entire left panel hanging open, exposing her plain white petticoat underneath. For 3 seconds, no one made a sound. Then someone laughed. It was a woman's laugh, high and bright, the kind that carries across a room because it is designed to carry. And then there was a second laugh, and a third, and the sound spread the way fire spreads when there is nothing to stop it quickly and without mercy. "Good heavens!" someone murmured loudly enough to be heard. "Did she not have her dress fitted properly?" someone else said, whispering but not quietly. "Poor thing," a third voice added. And the pity in it was worse than the laughter, because pity from people who could help you and choose not to is its own kind of cruelty. Eleanor straightened. She did not reach down to gather the torn fabric. She did not put her hand over her mouth, or step back, or turn toward the wall. She looked straight ahead at the space above the crowd, and she did not let her face move. The elderly servant caught her hand, the burned one, the wrapped one, and held it. The woman didn't say anything. She just held on. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "I've got you." The servant's eyes were bright with something. Maybe tears, maybe something else. "I'm so sorry, miss," the woman whispered. "I should have watched my step." "You watched your tray," Eleanor said. Nothing broke. That's what mattered. The laughter was dying down, as laughter always eventually does. But something worse had replaced it, the long, comfortable attention of people who have found their evening's entertainment and have decided to let it settle in. Women were turning away to whisper to the women beside them. Men were looking somewhere else with the studied disinterest of people who are glad something is not happening to them. No one stepped forward. Eleanor was aware of this in a way she could not quite describe. The way you are aware of cold when the fire goes out, not all at once, but incrementally as warmth drains and the room reveals itself for what it actually is. She had known these people most of her life. She had attended their dinners and their funerals and their weddings. She had helped organize relief collections for flooding families with some of their wives. She had sat beside some of them in church, and not one of them, not one moved. She kept her head up. She held the servant's hand. She thought about her father, who had walked into rooms far harder than this, and done it without flinching. "Hold your head up, Eleanor. Your father built something real." She held her head up. She did not see Benjamin Carter cross the room. She heard him first, or rather, she heard the silence that preceded him. The whispers stopped. The comfortable, settled attention of the crowd shifted. She heard the change before she understood the cause, and then she heard footsteps on marble that were unhurried, and certain the kind of footsteps that belong to a man who has never once needed to hurry to be taken seriously. She turned. Benjamin Carter was 37 years old, and he was the kind of man that a room reorganized itself around without being asked, not because he demanded it, because he had earned it slowly over years with the kind of quiet authority that comes from a man who has never wasted a word or a gesture in his life. He was tall, dark-coated. He wore no expression that she could read, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. He walked directly toward her, not toward the crowd, not toward the space beside her, toward her. The room watched. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her, not at the torn dress, not at the watching crowd, but at her face, like he was checking something. Like the only thing that mattered in that room was whether she was still standing. She was standing. "Miss Brooks," he said. His voice was low and even, and did not require silence to be heard, but the room gave him silence anyway. "Mr. Carter," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he held out his hand. Not an offer to help her to the door. Not a gesture toward a chair where she could sit and recover and be quietly managed out of the evening. His right hand open extended at exactly the height of a formal invitation. "May I have this dance?" he said. Eleanor blinked. The orchestra had not announced the next set. The floor was technically empty. This was not the moment in the evening when anyone danced, and both of them knew it, and every person in that room knew it, and Benjamin Carter held out his hand anyway, as though none of that mattered in the slightest. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "I don't believe the next set has been called." "No," he agreed. "It hasn't." He kept his hand where it was. Eleanor looked at it. She looked at his face. She had spoken perhaps 24 words to Benjamin Carter in the 3 years since her father's death, and in that time she had formed no particular impression of him, except that he was wealthy and reserved, and had an unnerving habit of saying exactly as much as he meant, and not a syllable more. She thought about saying no. She thought about dignity, and about not making the evening more complicated than it already was, and about the fact that her dress was torn, and her wrist was burned, and she had come here to speak to the commissioner's wife, not to cause another scene. Then she heard someone behind her say very softly, and with great satisfaction, "She'll refuse him. Watch." Eleanor placed her hand in his. The moment their hands met, the room changed. She felt it the way you feel a shift in weather, not through any single thing, but through everything at once. The whispers stopped. The comfortable cruelty that had been settling over the evening like a second atmosphere evaporated. The women who had been turning to whisper turned back. The men who had been looking away looked. Benjamin Carter led her to the center of the floor. Not the edge. Not somewhere quiet and unobtrusive. The center. He stopped. He faced her. His hand was at her waist with the proper formal distance between them, and he held her right hand in his left with the same unhurried certainty with which he'd done everything else tonight, and he waited. 3 seconds later, the orchestra apparently deciding that if Benjamin Carter wanted to dance, there would be music began to play. Eleanor had not danced in 3 years. She had not danced since the last event she attended before her father's death, before the estate sale, before the slow, painful collapse of everything that had been her family's life. She had told herself she did not miss it. She had mostly believed herself. She did not miss a step. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly as they moved. She was careful to keep her voice below the music. She was careful to keep her face neutral. She was giving herself every rule she could think of, Because she was very close to the edge of something she could not afford to fall over. "No," he said. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who didn't have an answer. The quiet of a man choosing between several. "Because someone ought to have," he said. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking somewhere over her left shoulder, which she understood you did not make eye contact during a formal waltz that was simply done, but his jaw was set in a way that suggested the looking elsewhere was also deliberate. "They're all watching," she said. "Yes." "That doesn't concern you." "It does not." "People will talk." People, he said, were already talking. "Miss Brooks, about you. Without your permission or your provocation. The least I can do is give them something worth discussing." Eleanor did not say anything for several measures. Then she said, "My dress is torn." "I know." And yet, he agreed. They danced the full set. The entire room watched them. Caroline Prescott watched them from near the fireplace, and the expression on her face went through several stages that Eleanor did not allow herself to enjoy too openly. The commissioner's wife watched with an expression that was considerably more difficult to read. The elderly servant had retreated to the edge of the room and was watching with her tray clasped in both hands against her chest. When the music ended, Benjamin Carter stepped back, gave a short formal bow, and released her hand. "Thank you for the dance," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. She heard her own voice and was relieved to find it steady. "I mean that, Mr. Carter. Genuinely." Something shifted in his face. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that happens in a face when a man decides not to say something he had half-formed the intention to say. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Brooks," he said. He inclined his head. He walked back to his position near the wall, retrieved his glass from wherever he had set it down, and stood as he had stood before, with his back to the wall and his eyes on the room, as though he had simply stepped out for a moment and returned. Eleanor stood in the center of the floor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she smoothed the front of her dress carefully, deliberately, with both hands turned, and walked back toward the punch table. The room exhaled. The commissioner's wife found her 10 minutes later. "Miss Brooks," the woman said. She was flushed, and something in her eyes had the particular brightness of someone who has just witnessed an event they intend to describe for years. "I believe we were discussing your school's reading program." "We were," Eleanor said. "I think," the woman said carefully, "that my husband would like very much to revisit that funding conversation. Quite soon. Before the end of summer, at the least." "I would welcome that," Eleanor said. "Good." The woman paused. Her eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, across the room, toward the wall where Benjamin Carter stood. Then she looked back at Eleanor. "Your father would have been very proud of you tonight." Eleanor thought of the burn on her wrist. She thought of old Thomas and the listing carriage. She thought of her mother's ribbon and the torn hem and the 3 seconds of silence before the laughing started. "He would have done the same thing," Eleanor said. "Just differently." The commissioner's wife laughed genuinely warmly and patted her hand and went to find her husband. Eleanor stayed until 10:30. She spoke to 4 more people. 2 of them approached her. She learned 3 pieces of information that might be useful for the school. She accepted a card from the man from Richmond, who apologized for not having come to speak with her sooner in the evening, and left a pause in that sentence, where the reason for the delay was understood by both of them and not discussed further. At 10:30, she found Thomas waiting at the bottom of the front steps with the listing carriage. "Ready, Miss Eleanor," he said. "Ready," she said. She settled into the carriage. The door closed. The summer night came in through the window, warm and smelling of river grass, and Eleanor let out a breath that she had been holding since approximately 8 o'clock. She looked down at her dress. The torn hem, the hanging panel, the plain white petticoat that half of Albemarle County had now seen. She pressed her fingers to the torn edge for a moment. Then she folded it up carefully and held it in her lap for the ride home. When she walked into the kitchen, and her Aunt Vera looked up from her chair, The old woman read her face in 3 seconds, the way only people who have known you your whole life can. "Well," Vera said, "the commissioner's wife will speak to her husband." Eleanor said, "The man from Richmond left his card." And Eleanor set the folded hem on the table. She sat down. "And Benjamin Carter asked me to dance," she said. Her aunt was quiet for a long moment. "Did he now?" Vera said. "In front of everyone. Before the set was called?" "Before the set was called." Her aunt looked at the torn hem on the table. She looked at Eleanor. She reached across and covered Eleanor's burned wrist with her hand, gently careful of the linen wrapping. "Your father would have liked that man," Vera said. Eleanor did not answer, but she did not disagree. The morning after the harvest ball, Eleanor woke before dawn. Not because she had slept badly, she had slept deeply, the way a person sleeps when the body has held itself rigid for hours and finally gives out. She woke because the house made a sound. A particular sound. The kind of sound that means someone has come to the door before the household is properly awake. She was dressed and downstairs before her aunt could stir. Thomas was at the back door. He was still in his driving coat, which meant he had not been home yet, which meant whatever had brought him back was urgent enough to come before rest. "Thomas," she said. "What is it?" He turned his hat in his hands. "There's talk, Miss Eleanor. Started last night before the carriages had even cleared the drive. I heard it from 2 of the other drivers, and then from Mrs. Patton's cook on my way home." He paused. "They're saying you pursued Mr. Carter, that you arranged the whole thing the fall the dress the servant woman, that it was calculated." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "They're saying I tore my own dress." "They're saying you had help tearing it." She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and unhappy. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Go home and sleep, Thomas. You've done enough." After he left, she stood in the kitchen and listened to the house settle around her. The burn on her wrist pulsed steadily. Outside, the summer morning was beginning in its usual indifferent way. Birds light the smell of the river, and none of it knew or cared what Caroline Prescott had decided to do with Eleanor's evening. Eleanor put the kettle on. Then she sat down and started making a list of everything she needed to accomplish before the end of the week, because that was what her father had always done when the world decided to be difficult. He made a list, and he worked through it, and he did not give the difficulty the respect of his full attention. She had a school to run. She had a list to work through. She got to work. The first week after the ball moved, the way weeks move when something has shifted beneath the surface of ordinary life too fast in some places and unnervingly slow in others. On Monday, Eleanor arrived at the school to find that 2 of the 5 families who had enrolled in the autumn session had sent letters withdrawing their children. No explanation offered in either letter, which was itself the explanation. She read both letters twice, folded them, put them in the drawer with the coal account and the letter from the man in Richmond, and every other thing she was not yet ready to decide about. She taught the remaining children their reading lesson and did not mention it. On Tuesday, Reverend Alcott stopped her after the midweek prayer service and told her with visible discomfort that several members of the congregation had raised concerns about her presence at the harvest ball, about her behavior, about whether her continued association with the charitable trust her father had established was appropriate, given he searched for the word, the current conversation. "Which conversation?" she said. He would not quite meet her eyes. "People are saying, Miss Brooks, that your attendance at Carter Manor was not entirely innocent in its purposes." "My purpose," Eleanor said, "was to find funding for a school that teaches children to read. I spoke with the commissioner's wife, with the minister's outreach coordinator, and with Mr. Harlan from Richmond about continued support for my father's charity work. I danced one dance at the invitation of my host, and then I went home." "Of course," the Reverend said. "Of course. I am simply relaying." "And now you've relayed it," she said. "Good morning, Reverend." She walked out into the summer heat and did not look back, but her hands at her sides were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From something older and harder than fear, the particular fury of a person who has done nothing wrong and is being required to prove it anyway. On Wednesday, she received a note. No signature. Delivered by a boy she had never seen who was gone before she could ask his name. The note said in handwriting she did not recognize. He is not what you think. Ask him why he never dances. Ask him what happened to the woman who taught him how. Eleanor read the note twice. Then she folded it into the same drawer as everything else and went back to grading the children's reading exercises. She thought about it all evening. On Thursday, Benjamin Carter came to the school. She heard the horse first. She was inside with two students who had stayed late to practice their letters. And then she heard a knock at the door that was neither apologetic nor impatient, just present, and she knew without looking who it was. She told the children to continue. She opened the door. Benjamin Carter stood on the front step with his hat in his hands, which she noticed immediately, because it was such a deliberate gesture for a man who struck her as someone who did very few things by accident. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Brooks." He looked past her at the two children inside who had entirely abandoned their letters and were staring at him with unconcealed fascination. "I won't take much of your time. I came to tell you something and then I'll go. You could come in," she said. "I'd rather not," he said. "What I have to say is short." She stepped outside and pulled the door behind her. The summer heat settled over them immediately, thick and golden, and smelling of warm wood and river water. He was quiet for a moment in the way she was beginning to recognize, not searching for words, but choosing between them. "There is talk," he said. "I know," she said. "It concerns you." "I know that too. I want you to know," he said, "that I am aware of the source, and I am addressing it." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "What does addressing it mean exactly?" "It means that certain information is being circulated about the events of Saturday evening that is not accurate, and I am in a position to correct it, and I am doing so. By telling people the truth, by making it clear," he said evenly, "that anyone who continues circulating an untrue version of events will find that I have a very specific memory of their own past social occasions and a great deal of patience." Eleanor blinked. "Mr. Carter, are you threatening people on my behalf?" "I am reminding people," he said with great precision, "that I have been attending the same social functions as most of them for 15 years, and my memory is excellent." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back perfectly steady, perfectly serious, and she had the sudden distinct impression that Benjamin Carter had a sense of humor that lived very far below the surface, and surfaced rarely, but at notable moments. "I don't need you to fight my battles," she said. "No," he said. "You don't. You seem to manage those considerably well without assistance." He paused. "This is not about your battle. This is about my name being used to damage someone, which I take personally." Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it. That was a different argument, and not one she had anticipated. "I came to tell you," he continued, "because I thought you deserved to know that someone is working against you deliberately, and it is not a spontaneous reaction to Saturday's events. Someone planned this before the ball. The rumors were ready before the evening was over." The back of her neck prickled. "You know who." "I have strong suspicions," he said. "Will you tell me?" He hesitated, only briefly, but it was long enough for her to notice. "Not yet," he said. "Not until I'm certain. I won't give you a name I can't stand behind fully." "That's," she started. "Frustrating," he offered. "I was going to say fair," she said. Something shifted in his face again. That near thing that wasn't a smile. "I'll let you get back to your students," he said. He settled his hat back on his head. "Miss Brooks, I want you to know that whatever is said in the coming days, I am aware of what I saw on Saturday evening. You helped a woman who was about to fall. You didn't think about your dress first. That is the only version of events I will endorse to anyone for any reason." He inclined his head. He turned. He walked back to his horse with the same unhurried certainty that seemed to be simply the natural pace of the man, as though the world would wait for him, and had always known it. Eleanor stood on the step and watched him go. Behind her, through the door, One of the children said in a theatrical whisper, "Who was that?" "A complicated man," Eleanor said, and went back inside. The following Sunday, Caroline Prescott approached Eleanor after church. This was itself a statement. Caroline did not approach people. People generally came to her understanding that her attention was a form of currency with a fluctuating exchange rate. For her to cross the yard and walk toward Eleanor in front of half the county was either a very confident move or a very desperate one. Eleanor held her ground and waited. "Eleanor," Caroline said warmly, as though they were fond acquaintances sharing a pleasant morning. "How are you holding up, darling? I've heard such unkind things being said. I want you to know that I personally have been defending you." "Have you?" Eleanor said. "Absolutely. I've told everyone that I'm certain you didn't plan any of it, that you couldn't possibly have anticipated Mr. Carter's reaction." There was a weight on the word reaction that was not entirely subtle. "That's very kind of you," Eleanor said. "Of course." Caroline touched her arm briefly lightly, the kind of touch that looks like affection and functions as a reminder of who's in control of the conversation. "Though I will say, and this is just between us, people are going to talk. They always do when a woman of your position attracts the notice of a man of his. You understand?" "What position is that, Caroline?" The warmth in Caroline's expression held but something behind it recalculated. "I simply mean that people are curious about your intentions. It's natural. And it might be wise if you want to protect what's left of your father's reputation to step back a little. Let the conversation die down. You understand how these things work." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the unsigned note in her drawer. She thought about two families withdrawing from the school. She thought about the Reverend's uncomfortable eyes. "I understand." Eleanor said exactly how these things work. "Thank you, Caroline." She turned away before Caroline could answer. Behind her, she heard Caroline say something to the woman beside her in a low voice, and she heard the word unfortunate. And she kept walking and did not turn around. The thing about a campaign against a person is that it rarely arrives as a single blow. It arrives in pieces, a word here, a door closed there, an invitation not extended, a conversation that ends when you walk into the room. Eleanor had spent most of her life watching her father navigate these things, and he had always said, "You don't fight water by fighting water, you redirect it." She had never entirely understood what that meant until the second week after the ball, when she began paying attention not to the hostility, but to the people who weren't participating in it. There were more of them than she had expected. Mrs. Patton, who owned the dry goods store on the main road, and whose opinion was taken as something close to law in the practical business of daily life, stopped Eleanor as she was passing and said, "You handled yourself well on Saturday night, Miss Brooks. Better than most would have. Your father raised you right." The blacksmith's wife, whose youngest child had learned to read in Eleanor's school, pressed a jar of preserves into her hands and said nothing at all, but held her gaze for a long moment and nodded. 3 different women from the outer farms sent notes to the school expressing support. Not formal notes, not the polished language of high society. Plain notes, the kind written by women who are more comfortable with a butter churn than a pen with crooked letters and genuine sentiment. And on the following Wednesday, a man named George Alcott, no relation to the Reverend, a carpenter who worked most of the county's construction, repaired the roof of the school without being asked and without billing for his labor. "My sister learned to read here," he said when Eleanor came out to ask what he was doing. "When she was 34, thought she was too old. Your father wouldn't hear it. Now she reads to her grandchildren every night." He kept working. "Figured the least I could do was fix the leaking corner before winter." Eleanor stood in the summer heat and watched him work and did not say anything for a moment because she did not trust her voice. "Thank you," she managed. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to hammering. It was through these people, the carpenter and the store owner and the farm wives, that Eleanor began to understand something about Benjamin Carter that the social circuit had either never known or had chosen to forget. She heard it in pieces, the way you hear a story that no one has decided to tell all at once. From Mrs. Patton, she learned that Carter had quietly funded the rebuilding of the Miller family's barn after it burned 3 winters past, and had done it without attaching his name to the contribution. From the blacksmith's wife, she heard that he had employed 3 men from the county's struggling veterans' families at wages significantly above what any other landowner offered, and that when one of them was injured, he had continued the wage for 6 months. From one of the farm wives delivered in a note in those careful crooked letters, she learned that the widow Hanson's farm had somehow remained in the widow's possession after her husband died in debt, and that several people credited this to a legal arrangement made quietly and without fanfare by an attorney who worked almost exclusively for Benjamin Carter. None of these stories were connected to each other. None of them were presented as a portrait. They were just things that had happened in the matter-of-fact way that ordinary people report ordinary events, without realizing that assembled together, they formed something significant. Eleanor assembled them. She thought about the note in her drawer. Ask him why he never dances. Ask him what happened to the woman who taught him how. She thought about a man who had crossed a ballroom for no visible reason, except that someone needed him to. She thought about his voice on her school's front step. I won't give you a name I can't stand behind fully. She was not certain what she was assembling exactly, but she was beginning to suspect it was something she had not accounted for in her original understanding of the evening. 3 weeks after the ball, William Hawthorne came to call. William Hawthorne was 29 years old and had inherited a law practice from his father, which was to say, he had inherited the income and the reputation without having particularly earned either one. He was handsome in a very deliberate way, the kind of handsome that requires maintenance and attention, and he had a manner of speaking that was courteous on the surface, and underneath it vaguely suggestive of the fact that he considered courtesy a transaction. He came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon with a card and a hat and an expression of practiced sympathy. Eleanor's aunt showed him to the front room. Eleanor came in and sat across from him and offered him nothing, which was itself a statement. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I've been thinking about you since the harvest ball. The whole county has been, of course, but my concern has been personal." "That's very kind," Eleanor said. "I want to be frank with you if I may." "Please." He leaned forward slightly. "Your father was a good man, a great man by the standards of this county. His work was genuine, and his reputation deserved. But reputation, as I'm sure you know, is a fragile thing. It doesn't survive indefinitely without support." He paused. "I've been in discussions with several influential families about a possible contribution to the school. A substantial one, enough to clear the debts, restock the supplies, ensure the operation for several years." Eleanor looked at him. He looked back pleasantly open, as though there were no second half to this sentence. "And," she said, "I beg your pardon. You said you wanted to be frank," she said. "That was not frank. That was the first half of a statement. What's the second half?" Something moved in his eyes. A small recalibration. "The families involved," he said carefully, "are concerned about the school's current association with recent events. They feel that the school would benefit from a different kind of patronage, more established, less complicated." Another pause. "I've offered to oversee the transition, as a gesture of good faith." "A transition," Eleanor said. "Of management," he said. "With full respect to your father's legacy, of course. Your involvement would be honored. As a founder's daughter, you'd be consulted on appropriate matters." Eleanor was quiet for what felt like a long time. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, "what you are describing is taking my father's school from me and offering me a ceremonial seat at a table someone else will govern. That's a somewhat direct," she said. "Yes, I find direct useful myself." She stood up. "I appreciate you coming. The answer is no. Good afternoon." He stood. His expression had reset to something that was trying to be gracious and not quite making it. "Miss Brooks, I would encourage you to think carefully. The offer won't remain open indefinitely." "I didn't ask it to," she said. She walked him to the door herself. She closed it behind him herself. She stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hand on the doorframe. Then she went to the kitchen and told her aunt exactly what had been said, because her aunt was 70 years old and had seen enough of the world to tell the difference between a man making an offer and a man delivering a warning. Her aunt listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, she said, "That man didn't come on his own. Someone sent him." "I know," Eleanor said. "You know who." "I have strong suspicions," Eleanor said. And then she heard her own words and thought of a man standing on a school's front step with his hat in his hands and the exact phrase he had used, and she felt something she could not quite name settle in the center of her chest. "What are you going to do?" her aunt asked. Eleanor looked at the drawer where she kept her list: the coal account, the letters from Richmond, the unsigned note, the careful crooked letters from the farm wives. "I'm going to teach school tomorrow morning," she said. "And then I'm going to figure out who owns the building my father's school sits on. And then I'm going to make sure no one can take it from us." Her aunt looked at her for a moment. "Your father," she said, "would have found a barrister, probably an expensive one." "I know," Eleanor said. "So will I." The attorney she found was a man named Silas Drummond, who had an office above the feed store on the east end of town and a reputation for taking cases that the more prestigious law firms declined on grounds of profitability. He was 55, rumpled, and had ink on his fingers at every hour of the day. He listened to Eleanor for 20 minutes without interruption, asked 4 very specific questions, and then was quiet for a long moment. "Your father," Drummond said, "filed this property under a charitable trust, not your family name, not the county education board. A private trust administered independently." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He did it that way deliberately. He said it made it harder to dissolve." "He was right," Drummond said. He shuffled through several papers. "This trust, as established, requires unanimous consent of its 3 trustees to be altered, sold, dissolved, or transferred. Your father was one trustee. Who are the others?" Eleanor said. "I don't know. He never told me." Drummond looked at her over his ink-stained fingers. "Then that," he said, "is the thing we need to find out." Eleanor left his office with a list of archive locations and a legal fee that would take most of what remained in the household account, and she walked home in the summer heat, thinking about a man who had spent his whole life planning for the future of something he would not be alive to protect, and about how much she had never understood about her father, until she started trying to follow in his footsteps. She was so absorbed in thinking that she walked directly into someone on the main road. She stumbled. A hand caught her elbow, steady, firm, unhesitating. She looked up. Benjamin Carter. "Miss Brooks," he said. He released her arm the moment she was steady. "I beg your pardon. I wasn't watching the road." "Neither was I," she said. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were standing in the middle of the road in broad daylight, and she was acutely aware of how many windows faced this street and how quickly a perfectly accidental meeting could be reported as something else entirely. "This is unfortunate timing." "Yes," he agreed. He seemed to arrive at the same calculation simultaneously because he stepped to the side of the road and gestured for her to walk with him away from the most direct sight lines. They walked for a moment without speaking. "You've been to see Drummond," he said. She looked at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because I recommended him to your father 4 years ago," he said, "when your father first established the trust." He paused. "I know who the other 2 trustees are, Miss Brooks." Eleanor stopped walking. She turned to look at him fully, and for the first time since the harvest ball, she let herself see his face, without the protective distance she had been maintaining, not as the wealthy landowner, not as the man who had done her an inexplicable kindness, but simply as a person who was telling her something that was going to change things. "Tell me," she said. "One is Drummond himself," Benjamin said. "Your father chose him because he's incorruptible and has no social ambitions worth exploiting. The other," he stopped. He looked at her steadily, "is me." The summer heat pressed down on them both, and the road was empty, and somewhere above them, a bird called once and fell silent. "You," she said. "Yes." "You have been a trustee of my father's school," she said slowly, "for 4 years." "Yes." And you didn't tell me. Your father asked me not to, he said. He said he didn't want you to feel indebted to anyone. He wanted you to run it as your own and to find your own footing without wondering what it meant that I had a legal stake in it. He paused. He trusted you. He just also wanted to make sure someone had the legal standing to protect it if it needed protecting. Eleanor was quiet. She thought about the school. She thought about William Hawthorne and his careful warning language. She thought about the note in her drawer. Ask him what happened to the woman who taught him how. What happened? She said carefully. To the woman who taught you to dance. Something changed in his face. It was not dramatic. He was not a dramatic man, but it was a change real and significant. The kind that happens when something reaches in past the outer structure of a person and touches something they keep further in. My mother, he said after a moment. She died when I was 22. She had been ill for a long time. The last thing she asked me, the very last, was to dance with her. One more time. And He stopped, looked away down the road. I wasn't there in time. I was 2 days ride out, and they sent a rider too late. I didn't make it. He did not say anything else. Eleanor did not say anything either. She understood now why a man who clearly knew how to dance had refused every invitation for 15 years. Not arrogance, not coldness, a debt. A private one kept private in the way of a man who does not make his grief into a performance. She thought about Saturday night, about him crossing the room without hesitation. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. He nodded once. He looked back at her. Hawthorne is working with Caroline Prescott, he said. I have letters. My attorney has been gathering evidence for the past week. Whatever they are planning for the school, it involves the forgery of debt records associated with your father's estate. They intend to present those records at the governor's winter charity gala in 2 months' time in front of every influential family in the county. Eleanor absorbed this. They want to publicly destroy my father's reputation, she said. So the school loses all support, so it becomes easier to transfer. Yes, he said. And you have letters. I have letters. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me all of this? You could simply use your position as trustee to block whatever they're planning. I would never have known it was happening. Because, he said, and now his voice was very quiet and very direct, the way it was when he was not choosing between words but simply saying the one that was true. Your father trusted you to run this. That means you deserve to know what you're running against. And because... He stopped. Because I have spent 15 years staying out of the way of things, watching from the edge of rooms, deciding that the world runs as it runs, and it is not my place to intervene. He looked at her steadily. I am reconsidering that position. The bird called again overhead, closer this time. Eleanor thought of everything she had assembled over the past 3 weeks, the carpenter and the barn and the veteran's wages and the widow's farm. A man who had never let his name get attached to a single one of the things he had done. A man who gave without marking what he gave. I'm going to need copies of those letters, she said. I'll have them delivered to Drummond by Friday, he said. And I'm going to need your testimony at the gala, she said. If it comes to it. I'm going to need you to stand up in front of those families and say what you know. He did not hesitate. Yes, he said. They'll say you're biased, she said. They'll say you have a personal interest. I do have a personal interest, he said, with a precision that made the air feel very slightly different. That doesn't make me wrong. Eleanor looked at him. He looked at her. The road was still empty, and the summer afternoon was wide and indifferent around them, and she made a decision in the quiet, practical way she had learned to make decisions since her father died, not with drama, not with ceremony, but with a simple internal acknowledgement that the shape of something had changed. All right, Mr. Carter, she said. Then we'll do this together. He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, Miss Brooks, he said. I believe we will. He inclined his head. He went one way, she went another. She did not look back. But she was thinking all the way home about a man who had been protecting things quietly for 15 years, and about whether a person could spend that long doing good in secret without also being in some private, unspoken way extraordinarily lonely. She thought he probably could. She thought he probably had. She pressed her hand to the front of her dress, where the burn on her wrist still ached faintly in the summer heat. And she walked home and did not let herself think too hard about what it meant that the loneliness she was imagining felt in some part of her. She had not examined in a long time, like something she recognized. The letters arrived at Drummond's office on a Friday morning as promised. Eleanor was already there when they came. She had developed a habit over the past 2 weeks of arriving before anyone expected her, partly because it was efficient, and partly because she had found that showing up early was one of the few forms of control she had left. She was sitting across from Drummond with a cup of his terrible coffee when his clerk knocked and delivered a sealed packet with Benjamin Carter's name on the outside. Drummond opened it. He read the first letter, then the second. Then he set them both down on the desk very carefully, the way a man sets down something fragile, and looked at Eleanor over his ink-stained fingers. "Well," he said. "That bad," she said. "That thorough," he said. "Whoever gathered these was not in a hurry. These go back 4 months, before the harvest ball, before any of this started." He tapped the papers. "This was planned long before you walked into Carter Manor, Miss Brooks. You were a target before you even knew the game was being played." Eleanor set her coffee down. "What exactly do the letters say?" Drummond was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the careful precision of a man who understood that how you deliver information is sometimes as important as the information itself. "William Hawthorne and Caroline Prescott have been in correspondence since February," he said. "The letters are between Hawthorne and an associate of his, a man named Fitch, who works the county records office. 3 of the letters discuss the fabrication of debt documents attached to your father's estate, specifically a claim that your father borrowed a substantial sum from a private lender in 1814 and never repaid it. The lender's signature is forged. The debt itself does not exist." He paused. "But the documents are well made, good enough to survive casual inspection, possibly good enough to survive legal scrutiny if the right people decided not to look too carefully." "The right people meaning the governor's circle," Eleanor said, "meaning every family in this county with money and influence and an investment in believing that your father was not the man everyone thought he was," Drummond said. "Because if he was not, if his legacy is discredited, then the school loses its moral authority, its funding dries up, and whatever fills that gap can be shaped by whoever fills it." He folded his hands. "Hawthorne is not doing this for Caroline Prescott's benefit. He's doing it for his own. He wants the property the school sits on. It borders his father's land on the eastern side. He's been trying to acquire it for 2 years through legitimate channels and been blocked each time by the trust." Eleanor stared at the letters. "My father planned for this," she said slowly. "He built the trust specifically to make it hard for anyone to acquire the property through legal pressure." "He did," Drummond said, "but he didn't plan for someone willing to go this far. Forgery is a different level of commitment." Eleanor picked up one of the letters. She read it. Her face did not move, but her hands, she noticed, distantly, had gone very still, the way hands go still when the body is directing all available resources to the processing of something significant. "They're going to present these at the governor's gala," she said. "In 6 weeks," Drummond said, "in front of the governor himself and every prominent family in the state. A public accusation backed by forged documentation. By the time the forgery could be proven, if it could be proven, the damage would be done. Social reputation in this county doesn't recover from a public accusation, even a false one." Eleanor set the letter down. She thought of her father, of the school, of George Alcott fixing the roof without being asked, and the farm wives with their careful, crooked letters, and the children who were learning to read, because her father had believed that every person deserved that much, at least. She thought of William Hawthorne sitting across from her in her front room with his practiced sympathy and his warning dressed up as an offer. She said very quietly, "They're not going to get away with this." Drummond looked at her. "No," he said with a steadiness that suggested he had made his own private decision about which side of this he intended to be on. "They are not." Over the next 6 weeks, Eleanor discovered something about herself that she had not previously known. She was very good at waiting. Not passive waiting, not the kind where you sit and hope and let time move around you. Active waiting, the kind where you prepare and plan and build and remain outwardly calm, while inwardly every piece is moving into place with the quiet precision of a woman who has decided that when the moment comes, she is going to be ready. She continued teaching school every morning. She marked papers in the evenings. She attended church on Sundays and spoke pleasantly to everyone who spoke to her and did not visibly react to the ones who didn't. She met with Drummond twice a week, always in the morning, always before the rest of the town was properly awake. She learned more about trust law than she had ever expected to know. She learned what a forged document needed to survive legal scrutiny and what it could not survive. She learned exactly what Benjamin Carter's position as trustee meant in a formal legal proceeding and what she could ask him to do and what he had already volunteered to do before she asked. He met with her 4 times in those 6 weeks. Always briefly. Always purposefully. He did not linger, and he did not say things he did not mean, and she had developed enough of an understanding of his patterns by now to read the things he didn't say, which was sometimes more informative than the things he did. He was angry, she realized. Not in a visible way. Not in the way of a man who raises his voice or makes dramatic statements. In the way of a man who moves very deliberately and speaks very precisely, and whose jaw, when he is containing something, sets in a particular way she had learned to notice. "You're furious," she said to him on the 4th meeting, which was in Drummond's office, with all 3 of them present. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Just that." "About the school?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "About the principle," he said. "A good man spent 30 years building something genuine, and 2 people who have built nothing are attempting to destroy his legacy for property value." His jaw did that thing again. "Yes, I am furious." Drummond made a small sound that might have been agreement. Eleanor looked at Benjamin Carter, who was sitting very straight and very still across from her, and thought about the barn he had rebuilt, and the veterans he had employed, and the widow's farm he had quietly saved, and thought that furious on this man looked exactly the same as composed on anyone else. "Good," she said. "Stay furious. We're going to need it." Something moved in his eyes. Not the near smile. Something older than that. "Yes, ma'am," he said with a gravity so precise, it took her a full 3 seconds to realize he was using the Western expression entirely deliberately. Even Drummond's mouth twitched. The week before the gala, Caroline Prescott made one more move. She visited Eleanor at the school. She came alone, no companions, no witnesses, which told Eleanor immediately that whatever she was about to say was not intended for public record. Eleanor was between students when Caroline arrived. She came outside and stood on the front step and did not invite her in. "Caroline," she said. "Eleanor." Caroline looked around at the school, at the swept front step, at the repaired roof that George Alcott had fixed, and her expression was one of careful neutrality. "I wanted to speak with you, before the gala." "All right," Eleanor said. "I want you to understand," Caroline said, "that what is going to happen at the governor's gala does not have to involve you the way you imagine it will. If you are willing to step back from the school, from the trust, from certain associations quietly before the event, then no one needs to present anything. Everything simply goes away." Eleanor looked at her. "And if I don't step back, then the documents will be presented," Caroline said. "And your father's name will be complicated before everyone who matters." She paused. Her voice was calm and reasonable and gave very little away, but her eyes, Eleanor noticed, were watching her too carefully. "I take no pleasure in this, Eleanor." "No," Eleanor said. "I imagine you don't. I imagine it would be considerably more convenient for you if I simply disappeared." "I'm trying to give you a way out," Caroline said. "You're trying to give yourself a clean solution," Eleanor said. "And I understand why. If I go quietly, no one ever has to explain the letters. No one has to answer for the forgery. No one has to account for how 4 months of planning got assembled against a woman whose only crime was helping an elderly servant not drop a tray. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands still. I appreciate you coming. The answer is no. Caroline looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, not softening exactly, but rearranging the way a person's face rearranges when they accept that a thing is happening they cannot stop. You're more like your father than anyone gave you credit for, Caroline said, and it came out with something complicated in it. Not quite admiration, not quite regret, something that lived between them. Yes, Eleanor said. I am. Caroline turned and walked back to her carriage. Eleanor stood on the step and watched her go. Then she went back inside and wrote a letter to Drummond telling him the offer had been made and declined, and to proceed on schedule, and signed it with her full name. The Governor's Winter Charity Gala was held on the last Friday of September at the Governor's residence, with every family of consequence in the county in attendance. Eleanor arrived in Thomas's carriage. She wore her mother's dress, not the pale blue one, which had been mended and put away. The green wool one, the one her mother had made for winter evenings with the small white collar her aunt had added the year before. She had no jewelry worth mentioning. She wore her hair up in a way her mother had taught her, which was simple and did not require much. She looked exactly like what she was, a schoolteacher's daughter from a good family in modest circumstances, who had come because she had been invited, and because she had every right to be there. Thomas helped her down at the entrance. He held her hand a moment longer than necessary. Your father walked into rooms like this for 30 years, he said. He never once let them see him sweat. I know, Eleanor said. You've got his eyes, Thomas said. When you're thinking, when you're deciding something, you've got exactly his eyes. Eleanor pressed his hand. Then she turned and walked up the steps. Inside the Governor's residence was everything Carter Manor had been multiplied. More people, more candles, more of the specific kind of warmth that expensive rooms generate when they are full of expensive people, enjoying each other's company. Eleanor knew perhaps a third of the faces. A third of those faces acknowledged her. She smiled at the ones that did, and moved steadily through the room looking for the people she had arranged to be there. Drummond was already present near the east wall with 3 other men. Eleanor did not know, but who he had briefed her about 2 attorneys and a retired judge with no financial interest in the county's social politics and a reputation for finding forgery in documents the way a dog finds bones. She caught Drummond's eye. He gave a small nod. She moved on. She found the commissioner's wife, who had been expecting her, and the woman from the Orphans' Charitable Board, and the minister's eldest daughter, who had come specifically because Eleanor had asked her to. She positioned each of them in different parts of the room with the patient deliberateness of a woman who has been thinking about this layout for 6 weeks. Not obviously. Not visibly. Just placed. The way her father had always placed people at dinner, so that the right conversations would happen organically at the right moments with the right witnesses. She did not see Benjamin Carter when she arrived. She did not see him for the first half hour. She was beginning to wonder whether something had gone wrong when she felt the room shift, that specific change in atmosphere she had learned to associate with his presence, and turned to find him crossing the floor toward her. He was not moving with his usual unhurried certainty. He was moving with something else, the precise, contained energy of a man who has received a piece of information and is bringing it to someone who needs to have it immediately. They moved the schedule, he said without preamble when he reached her. Hawthorne has arranged to speak during the first address, not after dinner, before. Eleanor absorbed this. How much time do we have? 20 minutes, he said. Perhaps less. They looked at each other. She felt something inside her go very quiet and very clear, the way things go when the thing you have been preparing for is suddenly actually happening. The retired judge, she said. Is he positioned? Yes. Drummond has the original trust documents in his coat. And your testimony, you're prepared to give it publicly, in front of the governor, in front of everyone here. I said I would, he said, and his voice was so steady and so simple that she stopped asking. All right, she said. Then we don't move until Hawthorne makes his accusation. We let him finish. We let everyone hear it. And then, he said, we answer it. 20 minutes later, William Hawthorne stood before the governor and 200 assembled guests and made his case. He was very good at it. She had to grant him that. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man who has rehearsed, who knows his audience, who understands that public humiliation is most effective when it is delivered with apparent reluctance. He expressed his regret. He expressed his respect for Eleanor's father's memory. He said he took no pleasure in what he was about to share. He said the truth, however painful, served everyone better than comfortable silence. Then he presented the documents. 4 sheets of paper passed among the governor's advisors with the careful gravity of things that are being taken seriously. The debt claim, the lender's signature, the dates, the amounts. A story about a man who had borrowed money he could not repay, who had hidden that debt behind a charitable trust, who had used the school as a vehicle to protect property that was rightfully owed to others. The room listened. The room absorbed. Eleanor, standing near the back wall, watched the faces she had spent 6 weeks studying and saw the specific expression that crosses a person's face when they are being given permission to revise their opinion of someone they had already half wanted to revise. Her father's reputation, assembled over 30 years of genuine work, was being quietly, publicly, surgically dismantled. She gave it 60 seconds. She wanted everyone to feel the full weight of it. She wanted no one in that room to be able to say later that they hadn't heard it clearly. Then she said in a voice that carried without needing to be loud, "May I respond?" Every head in the room turned. Hawthorne looked at her with the expression of a man who has expected a reaction but has not expected it to be so immediate or so composed. "Miss Brooks," the governor said, with the careful neutrality of a man who understands that he is suddenly in a more complicated situation than he had planned for. "Of course." Eleanor walked to the front of the room. She was aware of every face, every pair of eyes, the specific held-breath quality of a crowd that is watching something it did not expect. She reached the front. She turned to face them. She did not hold papers. She did not reach for documents or notes. She simply looked at the room and said, "The debt Mr. Hawthorne has described does not exist." Murmur, a real one, the kind that moves through a room like a wave. "The signature on the lender's statement," she continued, "belongs to a man named George Eliot Whitmore, who died in 1811, 3 years before the debt was supposedly contracted. The document that bears his name was fabricated. I have the original county death registry entry authenticated last week, which establishes this." She looked at Hawthorne. He had gone very still. "I also have," she said, 4 letters between Mr. Hawthorne and an associate of his at the county records office, written over 4 months beginning in February of this year, discussing the fabrication of this claim in considerable detail. She paused. "These letters are currently in the possession of Silas Drummond, who is present this evening and who will provide them to any legal authority who requests them, along with the testimony of a retired judge also present who has reviewed the forged documents and is prepared to confirm their inauthenticity before this assembly." The room was very quiet. Eleanor let the quiet sit for a moment. "My father," she said, "spent 30 years building something real. A school that has taught reading to 200 families in this county. Not because it was profitable, but because he believed that every person deserved that much. He built it quietly, without seeking recognition, and he protected it carefully through legal instruments designed to outlast him and outlast the social fashions of any given season." She looked around the room, and her voice did not shake. He was not a perfect man. He made mistakes. He had debts that he repaid in full before his death, as any honest accounting of his estate will confirm. The debt Mr. Hawthorne has presented tonight is not among them, because it does not exist. She stopped. She let the room breathe. Then Benjamin Carter stepped forward from the far side of the room. The movement was quiet. Everything about the man was quiet, but 200 people registered it simultaneously, the way a room registers a shift in light. He walked forward until he was standing beside Eleanor, close enough that their positions were clearly deliberate, clearly chosen. "My name," he said without preamble to the governor and to the room, "is Benjamin Carter. I am a trustee of the charitable trust established by David Brooks in 1814. I have been a trustee since the trust's inception." He reached into his coat and produced a document the original trust registration signed in her father's hand. "I have personal knowledge of every financial decision made within this trust's administration. There has been no unpaid debt. There has been no misappropriation. There has been honest, careful, unglamorous work done for the benefit of families throughout this county who will never attend an event like this one." He looked at Hawthorne directly. "I will provide full testimony to this effect under oath before any court or authority that requires it." He stepped back. He did not say anything else. Hawthorne's composure had been excellent. It was no longer excellent. He was looking at the room with the specific expression of a man who has watched the ground he was standing on simply cease to be ground. The governor looked at his advisors. They looked at the documents Eleanor had referenced. One of them, a serious man with silver hair, who had said nothing all evening, stood up and spoke very quietly to the governor. The governor listened, nodded. "Mr. Hawthorne," the governor said, "I think it would be appropriate for you to speak with several members of my legal staff this evening, before you leave." It was the most politely delivered ending to a public career that Eleanor had ever witnessed. Hawthorne left the room with two of the governor's men on either side of him. He left without speaking. He left with the particular contracted silence of a man who has understood precisely what has just happened to him. Caroline Prescott, who had been standing near the fireplace throughout all of this, did not leave. She stayed exactly where she was, and her face was composed and still. And she met Eleanor's eyes across the room for one long moment before she looked away. Eleanor looked away too. She had no interest in Caroline Prescott's humiliation. She had never wanted humiliation. She had wanted the truth told, and it had been told, and that was enough. The room began to breathe again. Conversations restarted. The governor's wife, with the practiced grace of a woman who has managed social situations for decades, called for refreshments and a change of topic. And the crowd, as crowds do, allowed itself to be redirected. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and felt something leave her body. Something she had been holding for 6 weeks, maybe longer. Maybe since the morning after the harvest ball, when Thomas came to the door and told her the talk had already started. Maybe since before that, since her father died, and she first understood what it meant to be the only person standing between the thing he'd built and everything that wanted to dissolve it. She felt it leave, and felt the specific lightness that follows, and took one slow breath. A hand touched her arm briefly, precisely at the elbow. The touch of someone checking that she was still standing. She was standing. She looked up. Benjamin Carter was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the near smile, not the deliberate calm. Something plainer and more unguarded than either of those things, the expression of a man who is relieved, actually relieved down to the bone. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly. Only for her. She felt the word land somewhere she hadn't been expecting. "We were," she said. "That was both of us." "The architecture was yours," he said. "I was simply there." "You were considerably more than simply there," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were standing in the governor's ballroom with 200 people around them, and the music starting up again from somewhere. And the moment had the particular quality of something that is happening, and also simultaneously being remembered as though the present is already aware of its own significance. "Miss Brooks," he said, "when this evening is concluded, would you—" He stopped. She could see him choosing between things again, but this time the choosing felt different. More weighted. More personal. "Would you permit me to call on you not for school business, not for trust matters?" He stopped again. "Personally." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. She thought about 6 weeks of early mornings and legal documents and the quiet assembling of truth against a campaign of deliberate falsehood. She thought about a man who had spent 15 years protecting things without putting his name on them. She thought about what he had said on the road. "I have spent 15 years staying out of the way of things. I am reconsidering that position." "Yes, Mr. Carter," she said. "I would permit that." Something settled in his face. fully finally in the way of a man who has been carrying a thing for long enough that he has forgotten what it feels like to set it down. "Thank you," he said. Simply. Genuinely. She looked away first because she needed to, and because the commissioner's wife was crossing the room toward her with an expression of great warmth and considerable determination, and because she had spent 6 weeks planning for tonight, and it was, she discovered, possible to plan so thoroughly for a thing that when it arrives, you need a moment to simply be inside it. But she was smiling when she turned. She was genuinely, quietly, all the way through smiling. And if Benjamin Carter, standing behind her as the commissioner's wife, took her hands and said something warm and effusive about her father and the school and the extraordinary events of the evening, if he saw that smile from where he was standing, he gave no indication. But he stayed where he was, close enough to be present, exactly as far away as was appropriate, as he had always been. The morning after the governor's gala, Eleanor slept until 7. This was for her an extraordinary act of surrender. She had not slept past 5 since her father died. There was always too much to do, always a list waiting, always the particular guilt of a person who understands that the world does not pause because you are tired. But that morning, with the autumn light coming in at the window and her aunt moving quietly in the kitchen, below, Eleanor simply did not wake up, and her body, which had been holding 6 weeks of weight with no complaint, took what it needed without asking permission. When she came downstairs, her aunt had coffee waiting and said nothing beyond good morning, which was the precise right thing to say. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The burn on her wrist had healed by now, just a faint pale mark, barely visible, the kind of scar that reminds you of a thing without making you relive it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she drank her coffee. "Thomas stopped by earlier," her aunt said. "Said the county is talking. About last night." About last night. Her aunt sat across from her. "He said he heard it from 2 different drivers before sunrise. That Hawthorne left with the governor's men. That documents were produced. That you spoke in front of the whole gathering." She paused. "He was grinning when he told me." "Thomas doesn't grin," Eleanor said. "He was close enough to it that I counted it," her aunt said. "He also said," she stopped, and something in her expression shifted, became careful in a particular way Eleanor recognized as the careful of a person approaching something they know matters. "He said Benjamin Carter stood beside you." "He did?" Eleanor said. Her aunt was quiet for a moment. "Stood beside you how?" Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. "In the way of a person who has made a decision," she said, "and is not apologizing for it." Her aunt did not say anything else, but when she refilled Eleanor's cup, she did it with the particular gentleness of a woman who is being very careful with something she considers precious, and Eleanor, who had known her aunt her whole life, understood exactly what that meant. By midday, 3 things had happened. The first was that Silas Drummond sent a note confirming that the governor's legal staff had taken custody of the forged documents and that a formal inquiry into William Hawthorne's conduct had been opened. The note was 3 sentences long, efficient and precise, with a postscript that said only, "Your father would have handled this the same way. Perhaps better, though I doubt it." Eleanor read the postscript twice and put the note in a new drawer. Not the one with the coal account and the unsigned letter, but a different one she was beginning to think of as the drawer for things worth keeping. The second was that 4 families who had withdrawn their children from the school sent word that they wished to re-enroll. 3 of the 4 included apologies of varying directness. The 4th included a large bag of flour and no note, which Eleanor considered the most honest response of all. The 3rd was that Caroline Prescott's carriage was seen leaving Albemarle County before noon, headed in the direction of her family's property in the northern part of the state. She did not call on Eleanor. She did not send a note. She simply left. Which was, Eleanor decided, a kind of answer to a question neither of them had needed to ask aloud. Eleanor read Drummond's note, received the family's letters, and registered Caroline's departure, and then she put on her coat and walked to the school and taught the afternoon lesson because the children still needed to learn to read and the world had not stopped for anyone. George Alcott was at the school when she arrived. He was repairing the front step, which had developed a wobble at some point in the autumn. He looked up when she came through the gate and said, "Heard you gave Hawthorne quite an evening." "Word travels fast," she said, "in this county." He went back to his work. Word doesn't travel, it sprints. He set a nail. "Your father's name is safe, Miss Eleanor. Figured you'd want to know that that's what people are saying, that he was exactly who everyone thought he was." Eleanor stood very still for a moment. She had not let herself think about this part of it, not directly. Not in the days of planning and the nights of going over documents and the careful positioning of people in the right rooms. She had thought about the school, about the trust, about the legal mechanisms and the testimony. She had not let herself sit with the simpler, more personal truth, which was that someone had tried to take her father's name and reshape it into something he was not, and that she had prevented it. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and her voice was steady, but only just. "Yes, ma'am," Alcott said, and hammered the nail, and did not look up, which was the most tactful thing he could have done. Benjamin Carter called on her the following Tuesday. He came in the afternoon, not the morning, which was a choice Eleanor noticed because she had begun to pay attention to his choices. He came on horseback rather than by carriage. He came alone. He knocked at the front door rather than the back, which was correct for a formal call, but which Eleanor also knew he understood the social implications of, because Benjamin Carter understood the implications of everything he did. Her aunt showed him to the front room and then disappeared with a discretion that Eleanor found both convenient and transparent. He sat across from her. He held his hat. He looked at her with the particular directness she had come to understand was not rudeness, but its opposite, a form of respect. The respect of a man who does not manage people by looking slightly to the left of them. "How are you?" he said. The question coming from him was not a pleasantry. She had learned that about him too. "I'm well," she said. "Better than I expected to be, honestly. I thought there would be more fallout, more cleanup." "There will be some," he said. "Hawthorne's inquiry will require a formal statement from you, probably within the month. Drummond will handle most of it, but your testimony matters." "I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of that." "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." He paused. His hands moved once on the brim of his hat, and then were still. "I wanted to tell you something. In person. Not through Drummond." Eleanor looked at him and waited. "When your father came to me in 1814, Benjamin said, and asked me to serve as trustee, I almost declined. Not because I didn't believe in the work, but because I had made a personal resolution after my mother died to step back from involvement. From people." He looked at his hat, then back at her. "I had decided that the safest approach to the world was to contribute from a distance, to do good as it were from behind a screen, to make things better without being present in them." "That sounds very lonely," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "It was," he said with a simplicity that took her breath slightly sideways. "I had convinced myself it was prudent. That presence meant risk. That if you cared about something openly, you gave people something to use." He stopped. "Your father disagreed with me thoroughly every time I expressed this view. He said, and I remember this exactly, he said, 'Benjamin, a man who only gives from a distance has never really given anything at all. He's just managed his exposure.'" Eleanor recognized her father's voice in those words so precisely that it was almost physical. "That sounds like him," she said quietly. "He was right," Benjamin said. "I knew he was right when he said it, and I spent 4 years arguing with him about it in my own mind. And then—" He stopped. His jaw set in that particular way. "And then I stood in that ballroom and watched you help a woman who was about to fall and tear your own dress doing it, and stand in the wreckage of that with your head up, and I thought this is what David Brooks meant. This is what it looks like to be present in the world, rather than managing it from the edge." The room was very quiet. Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. She was thinking about what it costs a man like this to say a thing like this. Not the words themselves, but the decision to say them, the deliberate choice to be visible in the way he had spent 15 years avoiding. "You crossed the room," she said. "I crossed the room," he said. "Yes." "And you've been crossing it ever since," she said. He looked at her. "I have," he said, "and I find I have no desire to stop." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not in the way of stories where people describe hearts rearranging themselves. Quietly. The way a window shifts when you open it after a long winter, just the movement of something that has been closed for a long time, and the sudden cool, honest air. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Benjamin." He looked at her at the sound of his name. She had not used it before. They both knew she had not used it before. "Why did you ask permission to call on me?" she said. "You're a trustee. You have legitimate reason to be here anytime you choose." "Because I wanted to come for a reason that has nothing to do with the trust," he said. "And I wanted you to know the difference." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Would you like coffee? My aunt makes it considerably better than Drummond does." Something broke open in his face, not the near smile, the actual thing, brief, real, and more disarming than she had prepared herself for. "Yes," he said, "I would." He came back on Thursday, and again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. The calls were by every formal standard appropriate. He stayed 1 hour. He sat across from her or occasionally beside her at the table, if they were reviewing documents related to the trust, which provided convenient, legitimate cover for a portion of their time together. He spoke with her aunt with the same direct courtesy he showed Eleanor, which her aunt reported to be both refreshing and slightly unnerving, as she was not accustomed to men who meant what they said without embellishment. What they talked about in those hours was everything and nothing. Her father, his mother, the county's history, the school's reading enrollment, which had reached 42 students, by October the highest it had ever been. The question of whether Virginia winters were worse than people from the South always claimed. The particular difficulty of making decisions about other people's futures without their knowledge, which was something they had both done for different reasons, and which they examined from different angles without quite agreeing. "You kept the trust from me," she said once, "for 4 years." "I did," he said. "I've thought about whether that was right. I'm still not certain." "My father asked you to," she said. "He did, and I respected his reasoning. But," he paused, "you spent those 4 years believing you were holding the school up alone, that if you failed, there was nothing underneath you. That is not a comfortable way to live." "No," she said. "It isn't. If I could change it," he said, "I would change it. Not the trust, the secrecy. I would have found a way to let you know there was a net." Eleanor thought about that for a long time after he left that evening. About nets and distances, and a man who had built scaffolding for other people's lives for 15 years without ever letting anyone see the work. She thought about what her father had said. A man who only gives from a distance has never really given anything at all. She thought about a man who was trying to learn at 37 to give differently. She thought that was not a small thing. She thought it was in fact one of the most significant things she had ever observed a person choose to do. In the 3rd week of October, Drummond called them both to his office. Eleanor arrived first. Benjamin arrived 4 minutes later, which she had also come to understand was his pattern early enough to demonstrate intention late enough to give the other person the room. She found it oddly considerate. Drummond laid 3 documents on his desk with the gravity he reserved for things that mattered. "The inquiry into Hawthorne is proceeding," he said. "He will face formal charges. The outcome is not in doubt, the letters are comprehensive, and the retired judge's testimony is ironclad." He adjusted one of the papers. "However, I have discovered something in the course of this process that you both need to know." Eleanor looked at him. Benjamin looked at him. "The man Hawthorne worked with," Drummond said. "The one at the county records office, his name is Fitch. We have known this. What we did not know until 3 days ago is that Fitch did not approach Hawthorne. Hawthorne approached Fitch. He paused. At the direction of someone else. The office was quiet. Caroline Prescott did not originate this plan, Drummond said. She was part of it. She coordinated the social campaign, the rumors, the pressure, the visit to Miss Brooks before the gala. But the legal component, the forgery, was designed by someone with considerably more legal sophistication than either Caroline or Hawthorne. Who? Eleanor said. Drummond looked at her steadily. A man named Richard Fenwick, he said. He is an attorney based in Richmond. He specializes in land acquisition. He has been quietly acquiring property in this county for 3 years through intermediaries without his name ever appearing in any transaction. Benjamin was very still. I know that name, he said. Most people in your position would, Drummond said carefully. He has been attempting to acquire land adjacent to Carter Estate as well, through the same kind of creative legal architecture. Eleanor looked at Benjamin. His jaw was set. His expression had the contained quality she associated with anger, held at significant pressure. He used Hawthorne and Caroline as instruments, Benjamin said. It was not a question. Yes, Drummond said. Hawthorne wanted the school property for himself, and Fenwick allowed him to believe that was the goal. But Fenwick's actual interest is broader. If the Brooks Charitable Trust could be dissolved, the property returns to the general estate. If the estate can be shown to carry debt, even false debt, it becomes eligible for forced acquisition proceedings. Through Fenwick's clients, Benjamin said. Through Fenwick himself ultimately, Drummond said. He is not as careful as he believes he is. Eleanor said, How long has he been planning this? At least 2 years, Drummond said. Possibly longer. 2 years. Eleanor sat with that. 2 years of someone she had never heard of pointing a plan in her direction, building a mechanism to take apart what her father had built, using people who were willing to be used because they had their own reasons. 2 years of being in the sights of something she hadn't known existed. What do we do? She said. Drummond looked at Benjamin. Benjamin looked at Eleanor. Fitch has agreed to cooperate with the inquiry, Benjamin said, in the careful tone of a man who has already been thinking about this. In exchange for reduced penalty on his role in the forgery, his testimony implicates Fenwick directly. Then Fenwick goes down with Hawthorne, Eleanor said. That is one outcome, Benjamin said. The more immediate one is, I need to be transparent with you about something. He looked at her directly. Fenwick approached me 8 months ago, about property adjacent to the Carter estate. I declined. He was persistent. I had him investigated, which is how I first heard the name Hawthorne in connection with him. That is how I knew before the harvest ball that something was being built. He stopped. I did not know it would reach you. If I had understood the full scope of it sooner. You could not have known, Eleanor said. Stop. He looked at her. You could not have known, she said again clearly, because she wanted there to be no ambiguity. You acted on what you had. You protected the trust. You gathered the letters. You stood beside me at the gala. She held his gaze. You do not owe me an apology for the things you didn't know. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally. But I want you to have the full picture, all of it. No more giving from behind a screen. Drummond across the desk appeared to be very interested in his paperwork. Eleanor felt the shift again, that same quiet movement like something opening. All right, she said. Then tell me the rest, he told her. All of it. Fenwick's approach, his own investigation the moment he began to understand the shape of what was coming, and the decision he had made to position himself as a trustee with legal standing, rather than simply a bystander with information. The harvest ball, which he had attended, not because he attended such events, he rarely did, but because he had reason to believe something was going to happen, and he wanted to be present. The elderly servant, who was not incidental, who was one of his own household staff, he had placed at the manor event specifically because he trusted her judgment about people, and who had reported to him that a young woman had helped her without a second thought, and paid a visible price for it. You knew her, Eleanor said slowly. The servant woman. Mary, he said. She has worked for my family for 20 years. Eleanor thought about Mary's hand closing over hers in the moment after the tear. The way she had held on. She didn't trip by accident, Eleanor said. She tripped, Benjamin said with great precision, because the floor was uneven near that table, which is a genuine problem I have since had corrected. But she would not have been in that position if I had not asked her to be present. He paused. She did not plan to fall. She planned to observe. The fall was real. Your response to it was entirely your own. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about this for a long moment, about the way a person discovers that the ground beneath a significant moment was constructed differently than they believed, and about whether that changes the meaning of the moment. It didn't, she decided. What she had done, she had done. Mary had been falling, and Eleanor had moved. That was its own truth, independent of everything else. "All right," she said. "You're not angry," he said, and it was almost a question. "I'm thinking," she said. "There's a difference." She looked at him steadily. "Were you watching me that night, before it happened?" "Yes," he said without deflecting. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I had heard about your school," he said. "Because I had heard about your father's death and what you had taken on afterward, and I had formed an impression from a distance, which is a habit I was trying to break." He paused. "And because, frankly, you walked into that room like someone who was going to get things done, and I have always had an undue amount of respect for that particular quality." Eleanor held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Drummond, what do we need to sign today?" Drummond looked up from his paperwork with the expression of a man who has been listening to every word and is making no effort to pretend otherwise. "3 things," he said, and slid the documents across the desk. Fenwick's name entered the formal record in November. The inquiry expanded. Letters were subpoenaed. Fitch testified with the thoroughness of a man trying to minimize his own consequences, which made him a very useful witness. By December, the county understood the full shape of what had been attempted, and by January, the understanding had spread far enough that it became the kind of story people told as a lesson. This is what happens when someone tries to use the law as a weapon against honest people. Eleanor was not present for most of this. She was at the school. She was teaching. She attended one formal proceeding, gave her testimony, answered every question directly and without embellishment, and went home. What she had not anticipated, what she had not allowed herself to think about, because there had been too many practical things to think about, was what happened to the school in those months. The enrollment went to 51 students before winter. The man from Richmond, Mr. Harlan, sent a letter confirming a 3-year funding commitment, the largest single contribution the school had ever received. The county commissioner's wife organized a public reading event at the school, which was attended by 64 people, and which resulted in a collection that covered the coal account for the next 18 months. George Alcott fixed the gate. Another man whose name Eleanor learned was Thomas Briggs offered carpentry services for any construction needs. The blacksmith's wife organized 4 other women into a rotation of supply donations. The farm wives who had sent notes in the early weeks now sent students, older students, women in their 30s and 40s who had never learned to read and who came in the evenings after their work was done with the particular self-conscious courage of people doing something that costs them to do. Eleanor taught them with the same attention she gave the children. She taught them without making anything of the fact that they came to her because she understood what it cost a person to admit they needed to learn something. She taught one woman, a farmer's wife named Nell, 43 years old, who had grown up in a household that did not consider reading necessary for girls for 6 weeks, before the woman could get through a full paragraph without stopping. On the day she read a letter from her daughter in Maryland, all the way through on the first attempt, Nell put the paper down and pressed both hands to her face, and sat like that for a long time. Eleanor did not say anything. She waited until Nell was ready, and then she said, "Would you like to read it again?" Nell laughed. A real laugh, rough and startled and whole. "Yes," she said, "I believe I would." Eleanor thought of her father every time something like that happened. She thought, this is what he meant. This is the thing he was building. She thought it was not a small thing. Benjamin came to the school in December. Not as a trustee, not with documents. He came on a Sunday afternoon when no students were present with his hat in his hands and the specific quality of purposefulness that Eleanor had come to associate with him when he had decided to do something and was doing it. "I want to show you something," he said. "If you have an hour." She had an hour. He took her on horseback with Thomas riding ahead as propriety required to a building on the edge of the Carter property she had never had occasion to enter. It was not large. It had been a carriage house once, from the look of it, but something had been done to it. In the recent months, the interior had been cleared and shelved and organized, and along one entire wall there were documents. Not recent documents, old ones. Carefully housed, carefully labeled, organized by year. "What is this?" she said. "Your father's records," Benjamin said. "The originals, all of them." He moved to the wall. When he died and the estate was being settled, there was concern that the documents related to the trust, the funding records, the correspondence, the legal filings might be misplaced. In the confusion. He paused. "I had them moved here, for safekeeping, until there was someone who knew what to do with them." Eleanor walked to the wall. She looked at the labels. She saw her father's handwriting on some of them. His particular forward-leaning hand, the one she had grown up watching move across paper. 30 years of work. 30 years of letters and receipts and funding appeals and student records and correspondence with families throughout the county. All of it here. All of it intact. She touched one of the folders with her fingertips. Just the corner. "He trusted you with all of this," she said. "He trusted me to hold it," Benjamin said. "He always intended it to go back to you, when you were ready, when it was safe." He paused. "I think it's safe now." Eleanor did not say anything for a long time. She stood in front of her father's work, 30 years of it, housed and protected and waiting, and she felt something that did not have a clean name. Not grief, though grief was part of it. Not gratitude, though that was there too. Something older and more complex, the feeling of understanding finally and fully the dimensions of a person you loved. "He knew," she said finally. "Didn't he? That it would be hard, that there would be people who would try to take what he'd built." "He knew," Benjamin said. He said, he stopped, seemed to decide. He said, "If something happens to me before Eleanor is ready to defend it, I need someone present who understands the value of what I've built. Not from a distance, present." He paused. "That was when I accepted the trusteeship." Eleanor turned to look at him. He was standing a few feet away with his hat in his hands, and his face was open in the way it was only when he had decided to stop managing the distance between what he felt and what he showed. "My father chose you," she said. "He did," Benjamin said. "He chose you specifically," she said. "Not because of your money or your legal standing, because of your character." "I hope so," Benjamin said quietly. "I have spent a great deal of time trying to deserve the choice." Eleanor looked at him. The afternoon was fading outside, the short December light going fast, and the room was growing dim, and she was standing in front of 30 years of her father's life, and across from her was a man who had carried all of it for 4 years without being asked to be thanked. "Benjamin," she said. He looked at her. "You deserved it," she said. "From the beginning. You deserved it before you crossed the room. You deserved it before the gala. You have always been exactly the person he believed you were." She stopped. "I just thought you should hear that. From me. Directly." The room was very quiet. He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than a moment. Then he set his hat down on the nearest shelf, her father's records, and he crossed the space between them, not quickly, not with drama, with the same unhurried certainty that was simply the natural rhythm of the man. He stopped close enough that she could see the particular expression on his face, the one she had been cataloging for months, without quite having a name for it, and which she understood now was simply him, without the management, without the screen present. "Miss Brooks," he said. Then, with the deliberateness of a man making a choice. "Eleanor." "Yes," she said before he had finished deciding what came next. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I find I am considerably less interested in giving from a distance than I used to be." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Good," she said. "So am I." The December light finished fading outside. Neither of them moved for a long time, and somewhere under the shelf that held 30 years of her father's work, in the quiet of a room that smelled of old paper and winter air, something that had been assembling itself for months through torn hems and legal letters and early mornings and hard testimony, and the specific accumulated weight of two people choosing again and again to be present in the same direction, quietly, finally, completely arrived. The new year arrived in Albemarle County with the particular quiet of a January that has decided not to announce itself. Eleanor noticed it the way she noticed most things now, not as an event, but as a shift. The quality of the light through the kitchen window, the sound the road made under different feet. The way her aunt moved through the house in the mornings, with less of the careful economy of someone conserving energy against an uncertain future, and more of the ease of someone who has decided the future is on balance, going to be all right. Small things. But Eleanor had learned in the past year that small things were almost always the real things. The large dramatic moments, the gala, the testimony, the documents, those were just small things that had accumulated past the point of invisibility. She was at the school by 7 every morning. The enrollment had held at 51 through the winter, which was better than any previous year, because winter was always when attendance dropped cold roads, sick children, the relentless arithmetic of farms that needed every available hand. But the families held, the evening students held. Nell came every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, and she could now read a full page without stopping, and she had started quietly, and without making a thing of it, teaching her youngest daughter at home. That was the part Eleanor had not planned for the multiplying. How the thing her father had built did not just run in the building he had built it in, but spread outward, person to person, in ways he could not have mapped. She thought about him often, in those January mornings walking the frozen road to school. She thought, "You knew this would happen. You built it exactly so this would happen." She thought he would have been insufferably pleased with himself about that. She was smiling when she thought it, which meant it was not grief anymore. Or not only grief. It was the thing that comes after grief when you have done the work. Grief requires memory without the weight. Love without the ache of absence. She was learning to carry him differently. T.A. Benjamin came on Wednesdays. This had become by January simply a fact of her week. The way the school was a fact, and her aunt's coffee was a fact, and Thomas's listing carriage was a fact. He came in the afternoon. He stayed 2 hours, sometimes 3. Her aunt had stopped pretending to be occupied elsewhere, and simply sat in the kitchen with her mending, and let the sound of their conversation fill the house, which Eleanor had chosen not to comment on, because commenting would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required a conversation she was not quite ready to have. She was almost ready. On the Wednesday of the second week of January, Benjamin came with something different in his manner. Not urgency. Not trouble. Something Eleanor identified after a moment as the specific quality of a man who has been thinking about how to say something for a considerable time and has finally decided to simply say it. He sat across from her. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. "I have been in correspondence with my family's attorney in Richmond," he said. "About Fenwick," she said. "Tangentially," he said. "Primarily about other matters." He paused. "My own estate. Its management. Its future." He looked at her directly. "I am 37 years old. My estate is healthy. My affairs are in order. I have for the past 15 years managed everything with the assumption that I would continue to manage it alone indefinitely." He stopped. "I have revised that assumption." Eleanor did not say anything. She was very still in the way she was still when something was happening that she wanted to hear all the way through before she responded. "I am not a man who does things by halves," he said. "I am not good at tentative. I don't know how to court someone the way other men do with gradual suggestion and careful implication. I don't think I would be convincing at it even if I tried." He looked at his hands for one moment and then back at her. "So I am going to say it directly. I would like to ask you to marry me. Not today. I'm not asking today. I am telling you that I intend to ask, and I am telling you first Because I believe you deserve to know what is coming rather than be ambushed by it. And because I want you to have time to think without any pressure about whether this is something you want." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You came today," she said specifically, "to tell me that you plan to ask me in the future." "Yes," he said, "so that I would have time to think." "Yes? And you did not simply ask." "I considered it," he said, "but I wanted you to have room. You've spent a year fighting for your independence. Your school, your father's legacy, your right to make your own decisions. I did not want to put you in a position where you felt you had to answer before you were ready." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the trust he had held for 4 years. She thought about the letters he had gathered before she knew there was anything to gather. She thought about the way he had stood beside her at the gala, not in front, not directing, exactly beside. She thought about 30 years of her father's records housed and protected and waiting for her to be ready. She thought about a man who had spent his whole life learning how to give without taking, who was still learning, who had chosen at 37 to stop giving from a distance and accept the full weight of being present. She thought about how that kind of choosing did not come easily to anyone, and how much harder it was when you had spent 15 years in the habit of the alternative. "Benjamin," she said. He looked at her. "Ask me now," she said. He was very still for a moment. "Eleanor," he said, and then after a breath that she understood cost him something. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. Simply, completely, without hesitation. Something happened in his face that she had never seen before, and would spend the rest of her life cataloging. Not relief, not triumph, but something quieter and more fundamental than either the expression of a man who has been standing outside in the cold for a very long time and has just been let inside. "Yes," he said, as though verifying. "Yes," she said. "Benjamin. Yes." Her aunt in the kitchen dropped something. Neither of them acknowledged it. "Yes." The county found out on a Thursday. Not because Eleanor or Benjamin told anyone officially. There would be a proper announcement, a formal one, in the appropriate time and manner. They found out because Mrs. Patton, who had the instincts of a person who has run a store on the main road for 30 years, and therefore misses nothing that moves through it, saw Benjamin Carter leave Eleanor's house on Wednesday evening, and saw the particular quality of the way he walked back to his horse, and told 2 people on Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, it had become 20 people, and by Friday, it was the county. The reaction was not uniform. There were people who were genuinely warmly pleased. The commissioner's wife sent a note within 48 hours that was effusive and kind, and somewhat longer than necessary, which Eleanor found endearing. Drummond sent a note that was 2 sentences long. "Good. About time." She put it in the keeping drawer. George Alcott stopped her on the road the following week and said, "Heard the news, Miss Eleanor. Carter's a good man. I've known his family a long time." He paused. "He fixed the widow Hanson's drainage problem last spring. Sent his own men, didn't charge a penny. Didn't tell anyone either. I happened to find out because one of his men is my cousin." He adjusted his hat. "Just thought you should know." "I'm collecting stories," Eleanor said. "Reckon you'll be collecting them the rest of your life," he said, and went on his way. There were also people who were not pleased. Not the same people who had laughed at the harvest ball. Most of those had made their adjustments by now, with the particular social flexibility of people who understand that the landscape has shifted. These were subtler objections, the quiet variety concerns about the appropriateness of the match, given their difference in age, concerns about Eleanor's practical suitability for the management of a large estate, concerns that, phrased very carefully, very reasonably, amounted to a belief that a woman without significant social standing was reaching beyond what was appropriate. Eleanor heard these concerns second and third hand, as she heard most things. They reached her filtered and softened by the people who told her, who clearly expected them to wound. They did not wound her. She had faced forged documents in front of the governor. She had faced a ballroom that laughed while she stood in a torn dress with her head up. She had faced the slow, deliberate dismantling of her father's name by people with the resources to make it stick. She had faced all of those things and was still here, still teaching, still herself. Someone's quiet opinion about whether she was sufficient was not in the hierarchy of things she had survived particularly difficult to manage. She said as much to Benjamin on their next Wednesday, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have heard some of it too." "And," she said. "And," he said, "I find I have the same reaction to it that I had to the ballroom watching you stand in that torn dress." He looked at her directly. "They do not get to decide what is sufficient. That was decided between us without their input, and it is not subject to revision." Eleanor looked at him. "You're getting better at saying what you mean," she said. "I have an excellent teacher," he said, and the near smile arrived with such precision that she felt it somewhere entirely unreasonable. In February, Mary came to see her. Mary, the servant woman from the harvest ball, the one Eleanor had steadied, the one who had held her hand in the 3 seconds after the tear arrived at the school on a Tuesday morning, with her tray no longer in her hands, carrying instead a small wrapped package and a directness that Eleanor recognized as the directness of someone who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it. "Miss Eleanor," she said, "I've been wanting to come for a long time. I kept losing my nerve." "Come in," Eleanor said. "Sit down." Mary sat. She held the package in her lap. She was somewhere in her 50s. Eleanor guessed the same quiet composure Benjamin's household staff seemed to share as a general characteristic which Eleanor had come to understand was less a coincidence and more a reflection of how a household run by a man who was precise about character tended to select for character. "I want to tell you something," Mary said, "about that night." "You don't have to," Eleanor said. "I know I don't," Mary said. "That's why I want to." She looked at her hands. "Mr. Carter asked me to be present that evening, to observe. I've been in his employ 20 years. He trusts my judgment about people. But what happened the fall that was mine? That was my bad heel and a floor with too much wax on it." She paused. "I've thought about it a great deal, about whether it was my fault that your dress tore." "It wasn't," Eleanor said. I know that here," Mary touched her head, "but here," she touched her chest, "I've carried it." She looked up. "What I want to tell you is that the moment after it happened, when you had the tray steady, and you looked down at your dress, and then you looked up at me, you didn't look angry. You didn't look like someone calculating whether I was worth the cost." She stopped. "You looked at me like I was a person, just a person who'd had an accident." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "I have worked in a great many houses, Miss Eleanor. That is not as common as it ought to be." Eleanor did not say anything. She could not quite trust her voice. "Mr. Carter told me afterward that it was exactly what he'd expected," Mary continued. "He said your father had raised you right. He said he'd seen it in you from across the room before anything happened." She paused. "I thought you should know that he was watching you long before you knew he was there. Not because he suspected anything, because he was interested in who you were." She held out the package. Eleanor opened it. Inside was a folded piece of lace, old and fine and carefully kept. "It's Belgian," Mary said. "Mr. Carter's mother brought it from her family. He's kept it in the house for 15 years. He asked me to give it to you. He said—" She paused, clearly quoting something she had been asked to memorize. "He said, 'Tell her it was the last thing my mother wore to a dance. Tell her I would like very much for it to be worn to another one.'" Eleanor held the lace. She thought about 15 years. She thought about a man who had not danced once in 15 years because of a debt he could never pay, and who had held his mother's last piece of lace in a house on a rise above the river all that time. Not because he was sentimental, but because he was the kind of man who keeps what matters and waits until he knows what to do with it. She thought about an October evening in a carriage house full of old records, and a man saying, "I find I am considerably less interested in giving from a distance than I used to be." "Thank you, Mary," she said. Her voice came out entirely steady, which she considered one of the finer achievements of her recent life. "Yes, ma'am," Mary said, and smiled, a real one, warm and direct. "He's a good man, Miss Eleanor. He's the best man I've known, and he looks at you." She stopped, decided not to finish the sentence. He looks at you like he finally knows what to do with all of it. The Harvest Ball at Carter Manor the following summer was the most anticipated social event in Albemarle County in a decade. People said it was because of the engagement announcement, which had been made formally in March, in the manner appropriate for such things. A notice in the county paper. A gathering at the commissioner's wife's house, attended by more people than had technically been invited, an evening that Eleanor spent shaking hands and smiling, until her face ached in the best possible way. People said it was because of the school's expanded reading program, which now served 83 students, and had been written about in a Richmond paper in terms that made Eleanor uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. People said it was because the Fenwick inquiry had concluded in April with a set of outcomes that sent 2 men to face formal legal consequences and established a precedent in the county about the fraudulent use of debt records that attorneys were still discussing in October. All of those things were true. But Eleanor, who had spent the past year learning to read the real reasons underneath the stated ones, understood that the real reason was simpler. People were coming because they wanted to see Benjamin Carter dance. Word had gotten around not from Benjamin, who would never have said such a thing, and not from Eleanor, who would never have said it without his knowledge, but from the reliable mechanism of a county that had been watching the two of them for a year and had drawn its own conclusions. People knew somehow that tonight was different. That the man who had stood at the edge of every social event for 15 years had made a decision, and they wanted to be present when it arrived. Eleanor dressed at her aunt's house as she had dressed for the first Harvest Ball. The pale blue dress had been properly mended, beautifully mended by a woman who had been a seamstress before her husband's death, and who had refused payment in a way that did not permit argument. Over it at her collar, she wore a small piece of Belgian lace, old and fine and carefully kept. Her aunt stood behind her and looked at her in the glass. "Ready," Vera said. Eleanor looked at herself. She looked at the lace at her collar. She looked at the woman in the glass, not the girl who had pressed her mother's ribbon into a dress a year ago, with a burned hand and a determined chin, but someone who had walked through a considerable amount of fire in 12 months and come out the other side with her spine intact and her heart astonishingly fuller than it had been before. "Yes," she said. "I am." Thomas drove her. The carriage did not list anymore. Benjamin had had it repaired in the spring quietly, without telling Eleanor, until Thomas mentioned it with profound satisfaction one morning. Eleanor had asked Benjamin about it, and he had said, "Thomas has driven you every day for 3 years. The least I could do was make sure the carriage was level." Which was so entirely him that she had stopped asking and simply accepted it as one of the ongoing evidences of how a man expresses love when he has been raised to believe that love is a verb. She arrived at Carter Manor for the second time. The lanterns were lit. The summer evening was long and warm and golden. The sound of the orchestra came through the open windows, tuning up in the slow exploratory way orchestras tuned before the music began. She walked up the front steps. Thomas held her hand at the bottom the way he always did. "Miss Eleanor," he said. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, the full measuring look of a man who has known someone since before she could read, who has driven her through every kind of weather. Who was there the morning after the first ball, when everything was uncertain, and who is here now on the evening when everything has changed. "Your father would be very proud," he said, "but more than proud." He paused, finding the right word with the care of a man for whom words are occasional and therefore significant. He'd be satisfied. The way a man is satisfied when the thing he built does exactly what he built it to do. Eleanor pressed his hand. She did not trust her voice. She turned and walked up the steps. Inside, Benjamin was standing where he always stood, back to the wall, eyes on the room, giving nothing away. Except that tonight, when he saw her cross the threshold, he did not wait for her to come to him. He moved. Not fast, not dramatically. With the same unhurried certainty that was his natural pace, but across the room toward her without hesitation, as though the geometry of the thing were simply obvious and had always been. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face, at the lace at her collar, and something moved in his expression that was too complex to name and too honest to look away from. "Eleanor," he said, "Benjamin," she said. He looked at the lace. "You wore it." "Of course I wore it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room was full, all of Albemarle County. It seemed pressed into Carter Manor for the second summer in a row, and every single person in it was watching them with the specific hungry attention of people who have been waiting for something. Eleanor was aware of none of them. "The orchestra is warming up," she said. "Yes," he said. "The set hasn't been called." "No," he said. "It hasn't." He held out his hand, right hand open, extended at exactly the height of a formal invitation. Exactly as he had done 1 year ago, to a woman standing alone in a room full of laughter with a torn dress and her head up. Eleanor looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought of everything that lived between that first moment and this one, the early mornings, and the legal letters, and the archive documents, and the December light in the carriage house, and the Belgian lace, and Mary's words. "He looks at you like he finally knows what to do with all of it." She placed her hand in his. The room went absolutely silent. Then from somewhere at the back someone started to applaud. It was not polite applause. It was not the careful, appropriate applause of a formal social gathering. It was real, sudden, and full, and building the kind that starts in one person's hands and runs through a room like a current because something has happened that everyone understands simultaneously without needing to be told. The blacksmith's wife was clapping. The commissioner's wife was clapping. George Alcott, who had no particular business being at a harvest ball, and had been invited because Eleanor had put his name on the list herself, was clapping with his whole arms, the way a man claps when he means it. Old Thomas standing just inside the entrance, because Eleanor had told him he was going to see this part was not clapping. He was doing that thing that was not quite grinning, but that Eleanor now understood was simply the face Thomas made when something was exactly right. Drummond in the corner was clapping. He was also, unless Eleanor was entirely mistaken, wiping his eye with his ink-stained sleeve, which he would deny if asked. Benjamin led her to the center of the floor. Not the edge, not somewhere quiet. The center. He stopped. He faced her. His hand was at her waist, and he held her right hand in his left with the same certainty that had defined everything he had done since the night he set down his glass and walked across a ballroom because someone needed him to. 3 seconds later, the orchestra, which had apparently been waiting for exactly this signal, began to play. Eleanor had not danced at any event in the past year. She had been busy. She had been building and managing and fighting and teaching and learning and choosing, and all of those things had left very little room for dancing. But the body remembers what it loves, and her feet found the steps before her mind had finished thinking about them, and she was moving with him in the center of the room, in front of everyone in her mother's mended dress, and her mother's repaired ribbon, and his mother's Belgian lace. And it was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. "You're smiling," he said. "You can see my face from there," she said. "I can always see your face," he said, and the simplicity of it landed in the exact center of her chest. They danced the full set. The entire room watched, and for once Eleanor did not mind the watching. She had spent a year being watched by people who were looking for weakness, for stumbling for the small visible evidence that she was less than she claimed to be. Being watched by people who were simply glad who had come because they wanted to witness something that mattered, that was entirely different. That was something she could accept. When the music ended, Benjamin stepped back. He gave the short formal bow. He released her hand with the proper ceremony of it. And then quietly, only for her, he said, "I have been waiting 15 years to dance again. I want you to know it was worth the wait." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about her father, who had told a reserved man in 1814 that a person who gives from a distance has never really given anything at all, and who had been right, and who had known he was right, and who had built a trust around that knowledge, and waited for the world to prove it. She thought about a burn on a wrist that had healed to a faint pale mark, about a torn hem and a room full of laughter and 3 seconds of silence before a hand was held out. She thought about the way love, when it is real, does not arrive in a single dramatic moment, but accumulates in the early mornings, and the legal letters, and the hours in a carriage house, and the Wednesday afternoons, and the Belgian lace, and every small, deliberate choice made again and again to be present, instead of distant, to give without the screen to cross the room. She thought about her father's school with its 83 students, and its repaired roof, and its evening class for women who were learning at 30 and 40 and 50 that it was never too late to claim what they deserved. She thought about Nell reading her daughter's letter all the way through on the first try. She thought about Thomas doing that thing that was not quite grinning. She thought about everything her father had built, and everything she had defended, and everything she had built herself in the year that followed, and she understood that the life she was standing inside of right now was not a thing that had happened to her. It was a thing she had made, choice by choice, step by step, with her head up. It was worth the wait, she said. For me too. Benjamin looked at her with everything unmanaged and present and fully given. And the room was full of music, and the summer evening pressed warm and golden against every window, and Eleanor Brooks' daughter of a good man, keeper of a real schoolwoman who had stood in a torn dress in a room full of laughter, and refused to be made small, took his arm and walked back into the party. She did not look back at the center of the floor. She did not need to. Some things, once they have happened, do not require looking back at. They simply become part of the ground beneath your feet. Solid, permanent, entirely yours. The music played on. The county talked and laughed and ate and drank and told stories they would tell again for years. Outside, the summer river ran dark and full past the rise where Carter Manor stood unhurried, going where it had always been going. And inside, in the warm and crowded rooms of a house that had been too quiet for too long, two people who had each spent years learning to give from a distance, finally fully and without reservation, gave from exactly where they stood. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.